Hello, friends. This episode of the Foundation Worldview podcast is going to be a little bit different than normal. Normally, I am answering questions that you, the listeners, have submitted. However, today we're going to be talking about God's faithfulness. Just a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of spending a few days with my childhood pastor and his wife in upstate New York. And my favorite part of my visit with them was just getting to hear stories that I had never heard before about how God has been faithful in drawing them to himself, in calling them and equipping them over the years and decades. And as I was listening to those stories of God's faithfulness, I was greatly encouraged, one, to see just how God has moved in and through them, but two, to see how the story of God's faithfulness in their lives has intertwined with the story of God's faithfulness in my life. Because without God's faithfulness in their life, I would be very, very different because they have had a huge impact on my life. Now, I know that many of you who are listeners of this podcast, that Foundation Worldview Ministry has in one way or another impacted your life. And so I thought what I would do today was just share the story of how Foundation Worldview even got started and the many amazing things that God did and has done and is doing to both create this organization and sustain it. And I hope that as you listen to this story, that you are encouraged, that you don't just hear it as a story of something that God has done for one organization, but that you just take this as just a precious jewel of how God has been faithful in your life, that I know that you have stories of God's faithfulness that I know nothing about, but this is a story that I do know about. And if Foundation Worldview Ministry has impacted you in some way, I hope you see how in God's faithfulness towards us, it's also his faithfulness towards you. Well, the story of Foundation Worldview really begins in the year 2011. And up until this point in my life, 2011 was the hardest year of my life. Just went through loss after loss after loss. And God was really just revealing himself to me and stripping away areas of sin that I didn't even know that I had in my life. And as 2011 came to a close, and 2012 was starting, I was completing my 5th year of teaching. And I had already noticed a problem that I've mentioned many times before on the Foundation Worldview podcast, that my students, they came from great Christian homes. I was giving them a biblically based education. They were involved in church, but they really lacked the skills that they needed to carefully evaluate the countless ideas that came their way every day and think biblically through them. So I had already started to see that problem. And because there had just been so much loss in my life the previous year, and I had lost a lot of relationships that were very important to me. In 2012, the summer of 2012, when I had off from teaching, I was looking for something to do, some way to invest my time wisely. And I happened to stumble across a website that had an advertisement for a program that no longer exists. But at the time, it was called the Focus Leadership Institute. And it was a young adults leadership institute at Focus on the Family. It was a semester long, was for young adults 19 to 26. And I stumbled across the website and started reading and thought, oh my goodness, I am so passionate about all these things they're talking about. I would love to do this. But then I looked at the dates of when their summer semester was. And the summer semester actually started a week before I was done with teaching. So I picked up the phone, I called an admissions counselor there, and I said, hey, I want to do this. Is there any possibility I could fly out for orientation and then fly back for the last week of teaching and then fly back the week after that? And the admissions counselor said, it's so funny that you should call right now. He's like, I literally just got out of an academic planning meeting. He was like, and we decided to push the semester back by a week. And I was like, oh my goodness. So he gave me the new dates and I was so excited. And I called my mom, and my mom said, Elizabeth, you do realize that last week now of the semester is the week of our family vacation. And my parents have been planning this family vacation for over a year. And I was like, is there any way, Mom, you think I could skip this? And she's like, Elizabeth, you can't miss family vacation. So I was like, oh my goodness. So I thought about it. I prayed about it, waited a few days. Then I called the admissions counselor again and focused on the family. And I was like, so now I have the opposite problem. I was like, now I can't make it the last week of the semester. I was like, is there any way that I could leave a week early? And he was like, Elizabeth, you have the craziest timing in your phone calls. He was like, I literally just got out of another academic planning meeting. He was like, and we decided that we're going to shorten the semester by a week this summer because of some conflicting schedules. And I was like, oh my goodness, these dates fit in perfectly with my calendar. So I was super excited. Well, then the tuition for the semester at the Leadership Institute was $5,500. And had been teaching for 5 years at a Christian school, was, barely scraping by financially. There's no way that I had, spare $5,500 to do this program. So I started like racking my brain thinking of, like, can I babysit more? Can I dog sit? Like, what can I do to get this money? Well, my school at the time had an endowment program for teachers where you could apply for a scholarship to do some kind of training that would benefit you in some way that would benefit the school. And now I had applied for this in the past, but I had always applied for like $1,500 or $2,000. That the max you could apply for was $5,000, but nobody really had the audacity to apply for $5,000. Where I thought, you know what, let me shoot for the moon, and if I land somewhere, before that, I'm no worse for the wear. So I applied for the $5,000 from my school, and the principal called me into his office a few days later, and he was like, "How serious are you about staying at our school?" And I was like, "Well, when God calls me to move, I'm going to move, but he hasn't called me yet." And he's like, "Okay, we're going to give you the scholarship that you have asked for." And I was like, "What? You're going to give me $5,000? And I was so excited. Like, I couldn't believe it. And I thought, oh my goodness, all I need to do now is raise $500. Well, as I was walking down from the principal's office back to my classroom, I was just elated. I was going to call my parents. I was so excited. Well, when I picked up my phone, I had a voicemail on it. And so I listened to the voicemail, and the voicemail was from that same academic or admissions counselor I Focus on the Family. Was said, "Elizabeth, just wanted to let you know that because you got your application in before April, I don't know if it was 30th or 15th, whatever, because you got your application in before that, we're waiving $500 off of the program fee." And I was like, oh my goodness, in one afternoon, literally, I have the $5,500 that I need. And so when I was there for that summer at Focus on the Family Leadership was really this pivotal turning point in my life. That as I was in the classes at Focus on the Family, all of a sudden the lights started coming on. And I was like, this is what my students are missing. They are missing the ability to critically think well. They're missing a foundational understanding of worldview and a basic understanding of biblical apologetics. And so I was so excited. That summer radically transformed my life. And to this day, that it was just a shortened semester, it was 7 weeks long. Those 7 weeks that I spent at Focus on the Family in 2012, best 7 weeks of my life, hands down. Well, I returned to my school in the fall of 2012, and I was really passionate about all that I had learned at Focus on the Family. So I asked if I could have permission to start an after-school class, worldview class for 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. Got permission to do that. Had a lot of students that signed up, but then I was searching for materials that would do what I wanted them to do, that would give students a basic understanding of the tenets of a biblical worldview and compare the biblical answers with other worldview answers, how other worldviews answer those same questions. And all the materials that I found, they either didn't cover the scope of what I wanted them to cover, or they weren't educationally sound. Like there was one homeschooling curriculum company that had a textbook that had some good information, but I was like, kids aren't going to learn, what naturalism is as a worldview by reading one paragraph about it in some textbook once. And so what I started doing is I just started reading books and doing some research, and I created my own curriculum that I taught after school. And the way that the students were transformed, it was just amazing. That everything about their lives was transformed. The way that they thought, the way that they interacted with others, the way that they did their academic work. It was so incredible. And everybody saw it and was excited about it. And so some of the board members at the school saw it, and they were like, "Elizabeth, we have to get you teaching this in the regular classroom. This can't just be an after school thing that a few students get." So I was really excited that after teaching that for 2 years, I actually got to start teaching it in the classroom. And it was my favorite thing to teach all day long. It was going really well. And then everything kind of came crashing down. That there was just one person who was not happy about what I was doing. And even to this day, I don't really know why they weren't happy. But they came to me and they basically told me, "Elizabeth, you are not qualified to do this. You don't have any education in this. You're not qualified to write materials. I am going to do everything in my power to stop you from teaching this." And I was just devastated. I was just like, oh my goodness, because this person actually did make it so that I was no longer able to teach this class at my school. And I was heartbroken. But as I started to pray through this, I realized that part of what this person said was true, that I really wasn't qualified to write this type of curriculum. That, yeah, I had done a lot of research and I had read a lot of books, gone to a lot of seminars, but I didn't have any letters behind my name that actually proved I had put in, the blood, sweat, and tears to be an expert in this field. And so even though that was really heartbreaking for me, to no longer be able to teach this to my students who I loved, it was a real wake up call that I needed to get some kind of formalized training. And so I started looking into degrees in Christian apologetics. And at first I was looking at Liberty University because I could do it all online. But then I thought, I really want to do the best of the best. And as I researched it at the time, the best of the best was Biola University and their program in Christian apologetics. And so I thought that I wasn't qualified because some of the top apologists who I knew had graduated from Biola. And I was like, I am so not prepared for this. So I started filling out an application for Biola and then decided not to fill it out the rest of the way, where an admissions counselor admissions counselors have a lot more to do with this story than I realized before. An admissions counselor reached out and said, "Hey, Elizabeth, we saw that you started this application. If you finish it, we'll waive the application fee." And I was like, okay, applying for free. So I finished the application in December, at the end of December of, I think it was 2015. And I was accepted at the beginning of 2016. And I was flabbergasted that I actually made it in, because I am not naturally a very smart person. And I did not know a lot about apologetics at the time. And, but I made it in. And then I was planning on starting in the fall of 2016. But I got a voicemail on my phone, and it was kind of like staticky, but it was someone from Biola saying hey, there's still 5 days before the semester start. If you want to apply for classes now, register for classes, you can start a semester early. So I was like, oh, I don't know. This is a really big decision. So I called a few people in my life who just have had a lot of impact on my life and got their thoughts on it. And everybody was like, yeah, why not start sooner rather than later? So I called Biola back. And I was like, hey, I got this voicemail. Don't know who it was from, but I'd like to register. And they passed me around to different people. And everyone was like, yeah, we didn't call you. We didn't call you. We didn't call you. And I was like, what? I got this voicemail, but everybody was claiming they didn't call me. But they did let me register for classes and started the apologetics degree. And starting that semester was pivotal for starting Foundation Worldview, because some of the relationships that I developed that semester that I would not have been able to develop if I had started a semester later. Some of those relationships were people that were foundational in helping me to start Foundation Worldview. So worked on that apologetics degree. It was so hard to teach and to do that degree at the same time. Literally my schedule for 2 years was I would get up at 4 a.m. and I would work on Biola homework from 4 to 7. Then I would get ready from 7 to 8. I would teach from 8 to 4. I would come home at 4. From 4 to 10 p.m. I would work on homework, and then I'd sleep from 10 to 4 a.m. And it was like that for 2 years, and it was crazy. And eventually in the second year, I started to experience this restlessness that I just could not shake. And I started to pray through it. And I asked my parents, my pastor and his wife from growing up, and another friend and her husband, to just pray with me, to ask, is this restlessness God showing me that I'm supposed to leave teaching and start doing, what I'm training to do more full time? Or am I just not practicing gratitude, and I'm just kind of getting antsy? Because I'm a millennial, and us millennials, we tend to get antsy a lot and switch from one thing to the next. So after 6 weeks of praying about it, everybody that I asked to pray with me was in agreement that it really seemed like God was calling me out of the classroom to finish this apologetics degree and to then start a company. So I submitted my letter of resignation, and I was scared to death, because here I am, a single female. I was in my early 30s at the time. And everybody was like, Elizabeth, this is great. This is the time to do this. You're young, you're single, take this risk. And I was like, okay, young means I have barely any money in savings, and single means that I'm the only one bringing in an income. The buck stops here. I don't know that this is the time to do this. So I left, and I had complete peace that it was the right thing to do, but I was really scared. But God just kept providing. Several weeks after I handed in my letter of resignation, I was still finishing up the school year. I was in the teacher's room and making some photocopies, and a mom was in there who knew me kind of well. And she was like, Elizabeth, are you okay? You look a little bit off today. And I was like, well, I resigned. I sent in my letter of resignation, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do next. And she was like, what? And then she sat down with me. She asked me to tell her about it. And then at the end of me telling her about this, she's like, Elizabeth, how much does your rent cost each month? And I told her, and she pulls out her checkbook and she writes me a check for a year's worth of rent. And I was like, whoa, like, thank you so much. But this is like a lot of money. Like, why don't you go home, talk with your husband about this, pray about this? And she was like, nope, the Lord told you what to do. And now he told me what to do. And she ripped the check out of her book and handed it to me. And I was like, okay, Lord, like, I don't know how I'm eating next year, but you have just provided, where I'm going to live for next year. So it was incredible. And then the pastor who I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the pastor who from my childhood, he talked with me a few months later and was like, what if you became a short-term missionary, that our church we raise support to support you for a few years until you get this off the ground. And I was like, okay, so raise support. So everyone at First Baptist Church of Peekskill, New York was so amazing in supporting me for about almost 3 years. And the first year when I left teaching, this was when I started Foundation Worldview. And I thought, okay, Lord, I want to do this, modestly. I want to, not have a lot of bells and whistles or flashy things. But one thing I really am passionate about is that anything that has Jesus's name on it needs to be top quality, because Jesus is the creator and sustainer of the universe. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And if we're putting something in front of children that has Jesus's name on it, it needs to be top quality. So I started praying through this because I knew that starting the company, building a website, filming a curriculum was just going to cost tens and tens of thousands of dollars. Started praying through that. And a local businessman called me and said, hey, I heard what you've been up to. Like, tell me a little bit more about it. I just want to learn more about it. So I told him, and then he was like, so how are you going to fund all this? I was like, I have no idea, but all I know is that God has called me to this and he's going to provide. And he was like, well, I have been praying about this. He was like, and I would like to offer you an interest-free loan of up to $100,000. And I was just floored that God provided the money to start the company right away. And even just in our first years, nobody knew who Foundation Worldview was, had ever heard of us. Just seeing God's hand that first year that we were officially a company for a whole year in 2019, we traveled around to lots of homeschooling conferences. And some of them I even traveled to by myself. I traveled to 14 homeschooling conferences in 2019. I hope to never do that again because it was an exhausting year, but just saw God provide in so many ways that, I was on so many flights to travel to 14 different conferences. And throughout that whole year, I did not have one canceled flight or lost bag. And I had a lot of bags with me because I had to travel with a whole booth and all of our materials. So I had one huge suitcase that I would check that had all of our booth materials in it. I had another huge suitcase that I would check that had all of our promotional materials and other things we needed at the booth. And then I had one carry-on with my clothes in it. And even just seeing God provide in little ways, that one day I was getting on the shuttle bus at Midway Airport in Chicago, and I was, lifting up, one at a time, these 3 heavy suitcases. And this man looks at me and is like, my goodness, what have you gotten those? And I was explaining it to him. And he was like, wow, this is fascinating. And so he asked for a business card and I gave him a business card. And a few days later, I got an email from him and he was like, hey, just, I'm really excited about what you're doing. And I'm a medical doctor. God has provided me with tons of finances. He's like, can I pay to have your bags shipped between conferences, through UPS so that you don't have to pay for them? So just like amazing things. And then as the company, as we began to grow very, very tiny, when I say grow, I mean, we went from having 10 people use our curriculum to having 100 people use our curriculum. We were still very, very tiny. It just became evident that we needed different people to do different things. And so at just the right time, God had my sister and her husband move because my brother-in-law is in the armed forces and my sister had to leave her teaching job mid-year. And she started working for Foundation Worldview, and she is so well equipped just for what she does. She handles all of our administrative stuff and she's just excellent. And I love getting to work with her. And then several years into the company, 2 years into the company, it became obvious that this simple website that we had built initially was just not going to cut it. And I was like, oh man, where am I going to find a web development team where they do excellent work at a quality price and, they also understand our worldview? And then just through random connections that I never would have expected, just came across the most amazing company that handles they built us a new website. They handle all of our digital marketing. all of our media stuff. In fact, you're watching this or listening to this podcast right now because their team, has engineered it and done all of that work. Then we eventually needed someone to do some customer service and customer relations. And, didn't know where I was going to find somebody, that would want to work for just maybe like 10 or so hours a week, but also does a really great job of connecting with people over the phone. And I bumped into an old coworker, and she just happened to tell me that she had bumped into another old coworker of ours a few weeks before who was looking for a part-time job. And just, this has happened time and time and time again. Today there's 7 of us, they're working on Foundation Worldview, and every single person God has just brought along in really incredible ways. And then the final really big way in which God just like paved the way for us is in 2021, I started feeling that same sense of restlessness, like the Lord was showing me something, and just again, asked those same people to be praying with me. And it just became very obvious that the Lord was calling me to move from Chicago, where I had been for the past decade and a half, to a place where it was much more affordable. And so I moved across the country. God miraculously provided a house for me at the time. I was a little more than $10,000 short of what I would need for a down payment. And I just prayed, Lord, if you're wanting me to move, and this is the place where you're wanting me to move, like, I'm going to need you to provide the finances that I am short with. And the next morning I got an email from my accountant telling me that we had majorly messed up on my estimated quarterly taxes the year before, and that I was getting back several $1,000s more than what I had been praying for from the Lord. And so God provided for that. And as I moved into this new house, which is, I'm recording from this house right now, what I didn't know is that in that year of 2021, I was going to need a house where I wasn't sharing it with roommates and wasn't sharing internet and other things. Because in July of 2021, Pastor Mike Winger from Bible Thinker very graciously had me on his channel to talk about 7 common lies that our kids believe. And I was like, wow, maybe like 5,000 people will see this interview. Won't it be amazing? What I didn't realize was that as I was doing the interview, about 5,000 people were watching it live, and that another over 400,000 people would watch it later. And so it was that interview in July of 2021 that took us from a really teeny tiny minuscule company to still a small company, but a company that services tens of thousands of people each year with curriculum to equip kids. And so all of these things, I just told you a lot of the high points in the story, through this journey of starting Foundation Worldview and continuing with it. There have been a lot of hard times. There's been a lot of times of discouragement. There's been a lot of times of spiritual attack. There's been many, many times of uncertain finances. However, the overwhelming narrative, the overarching story is God's faithfulness. And I hope you've heard throughout the story, that without God's supernatural provision, Foundation Worldview would not exist today. I am so honored and privileged that I get to invest my time vocationally in this ministry. And I'm so grateful that this is what God has called me to. But I certainly hope that I have no delusions of grandeur, and that I understand that without God's miraculous provision, Foundation Worldview would not exist today, that it has solely been by his grace. And I hope that as you have heard this story that I've shared, that you haven't just heard the story of God's faithfulness in my life, but that you've seen a little glimpse, if Foundation Worldview has blessed you in any way, that blessing that you have received, that this story of faithfulness is also your story as well, that God had you in mind and your children in mind as he was doing all of these things in Foundation Worldview. I don't know how long God has called Foundation Worldview to exist. We could exist for the next 100 years. We could exist for the next 100 months. We could exist for the next 1 year. I have no idea. But what I do know is that the existence of this ministry is purely by God's grace. And I hope that you're encouraged by what you've heard today. And if you have stories, and I know most of you, if not all of you, do, just of God's faithfulness in your own life in ways that you've seen him miraculously provide for you. If you're watching on YouTube and you'd like to share those in the comments, would love to hear about that. I think it's always encouraging just to hear how God has been faithful in and through others. Well, thank you for investing the time listening to this story of God's faithfulness in Foundation Worldview, which is also a small part of God's faithfulness in your life as well. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of his Son. I'll see you next time.